Mr. Schiff.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Madam Secretary, for joining us today. I have two questions that are interrelated. The first goes to a point you made in your opening statement about changing the Department of State to a national security agency, and that being reflective of the transformational diplomacy mission that you see the Department has. And I think that's a nice gesture, but when I look at the budget that you proposed in the supplemental, which I think is a reflection of the 08 budget and the 07 budget, I wonder whether that priority is really reflected in the budget. And what I mean by that is, in Iraq, you've requested in the supplemental $200 million to strengthen Iraq's judicial processes, anti-corruption initiatives, another $428 million for democracy programs, dealing with political parties, civil society organizations, political institutions such as Parliament. That alone is over $500 million. Later in your presentation, you request only $20 million for public diplomacy funds to counter ideological support for terrorism, especially in critical countries. Some of these funds will be used to fund international information programs to engage Muslim communities, promote democracy and good governance, refute the idea that the West is at war with Islam, and isolate and discredit terrorist leaders and organizations. I think that is extraordinarily important, but you're requesting $20 million for that effort in the entire world, and over $500 million for democracy, rule of law efforts within Iraq. And this is just a supplemental. We're going to be spending more in a single day, every day in Iraq, than we spend in these public diplomacy efforts around the world for the entire year. That, to me, doesn't seem like the right priority. I question, how can we spend $500 million on top of what we're already spending this year in Iraq, in the middle of a civil war, on these, on the judiciary, on the Parliament, on these other institutions? How can we realistically and effectively spend that kind of money, given the security environment? It just doesn't seem possible. And also in the context of only spending $20 million in the rest of the Muslim world. If you look at Somalia, I'm very concerned about Somalia becoming the next Afghanistan. We'd be spending a fraction of this $20 million in Somalia, in theory. If Somalia becomes Afghanistan, we're going to be spending billions, and that'll be the least of our problems if Somalia becomes Afghanistan. So if you could speak to those priorities. The second question I have is, you also mentioned in your testimony that you want to overcome the caveat that the NATO forces have on what they can do in Afghanistan. I'm concerned about the caveat both NATO and we have about what can be done in the area of Pakistan adjacent to Afghanistan, where it appears that Musharraf has cut a deal with provincial leaders that has in fact created the same safe haven for al-Qaeda that we're worried about being formed in Iraq after we leave. What is being done? It seems to me the provincial leaders have done a better job negotiating with Musharraf than we have, and what can be done to end the safe haven in that part of Pakistan for al-Qaeda? Those are my two questions.
Thank you, Congressman. On the second point about Pakistan, we have been concerned about the federally administered tribal areas, that Waziristan area, and the cross-border terrorism that takes place there. We have been supportive of a plan that President Musharraf put together to try and empower tribal leaders, to try to use the tribal networks there to deal with the problems. Frankly, there have been some problems and some disappointments with that plan, and while we want to support the economic development of the Fatah, I'm told by people who've been there that it is one of the most remote in terms of education and reconstruction, and we want to support that because that will ultimately help with the terrorism problem. We've also been very clear with President Musharraf that he has to do something about the cross-border issues there. And I think you'll note that on a couple of occasions the Pakistani military has actually carried out operations recently, even though there had been this agreement. And so I think that we are determined with him. He has every reason to not to have that area be a safe haven. It is something that we're working very, very closely with him on. In terms of the distribution of resources in the supplemental, let me be clear that the Iraq program is principally tied to the counterinsurgency efforts that we're making through the PRTs. So when you see a national capacity building program, which is here in the supplemental, it's very often to help ministries with something like budget execution so that they can get the monies out to the provinces. The Congresswoman Lowy mentioned that there have been problems with some of the Sunni areas getting funding. Well, we are trying to help them build capacity to make sure that that money gets out, that the will is there, but the capacity is there too. Now, when you look at the number here that's here for public diplomacy, and it's actually 20 million in our DNC&P accounts, and then 20 million for programs, so it's 40 million. This is a very specific program that is targeted to, I think it's 15 states that we want to run very targeted programs where we can measure, see what works. We're spending in our budgetary, our regular budget, $360 million on public diplomacy programs. So this is a program that Karen Hughes and her people have put together to target our academic exchanges and professional and cultural exchanges to some countries where there's a very high need to have a hearts and minds kind of approach. And so this is specific, and that's why it's in a supplemental rather than in overall budget support. I have significantly increased public diplomacy support since I've been secretary. And I'm a big believer in educational exchange, in cultural exchange. I don't think you could absorb some of the huge numbers that we are doing in democracy programs around the world, because there are, in effect, only so many people you can bring to the United States, only so many people you can exchange. But I've been a big supporter of these. I think you will see that there have been steady increases, in fact, pretty dramatic increases in public diplomacy funding since I've been secretary. But this is a very specific program that, if it works in these targeted areas, I would expect to try to scale up. It's targeting, for instance, some of the youth 18 to 13 years old, which seems to be a group that would be most likely to end up in a madrasa, where we really don't have programs. We've got programs for university people, but what about those kids? So this is a pretty specific program.
Thank you, Mr. Schiff. And Madam Secretary, we're going to be having a hearing on this issue later on, because I think it's important to evaluate the efficiency, the efficacy of these programs, which have been questioned by many.